We come to the second evening, and the theme for exploration may sound odd at first, Deuteronomy, the prophetic stream and public theology today. I hope that becomes clear why there's a bit of a focus on a book like Deuteronomy when we're looking at Amos. But that prophetic stream that provided, as we saw last week, Abraham Heschel in 1930s Nazi Germany with a new way of thinking. It burst into the life of the divided southern and northern kingdoms of Judah and Israel between 800 and 600 BCE. The first written prophet is thought to be Amos, who appeared in the northern kingdom around 752. Now, the 8th century saw three other prophets, Hosea, Isaiah of Jerusalem, and Micah. And the latter two were active in the southern kingdom of Judah, with Isaiah, that is chapters 1 to 39, resident in Jerusalem and having access to the Judean royal court. These prophets insisted that religious commitments and social ethics were inseparable, that faithful living and ethical praxis, especially in relation to the poor, are what God requires. In 722 BCE, the northern kingdom was destroyed and wiped from history by the Assyrian Empire. In the 7th century, there were international upheavals and social and political insecurities, and these threatened the little kingdom of Judah. There may have been numerous prophets, even guilds of prophets, but only 6 are known to us from their books, not necessarily written by them, but by scribes and secretaries and the additional work of editors during the 6th century exile and the return. And these prophets we know as Nahum, Zephaniah, Habakkuk, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and an unknown or unnamed prophet we refer to as 2nd Isaiah, that is chapters 40 to 55 of that book. The dominant political power is the Babylonian Empire, which in a great geopolitical shift has crushed and replaced the Assyrians. Nahum belongs to the fall of the Assyrians, and perhaps 2 decades later, just before the Judeans go into Babylonian exile, we have Zephaniah and Habakkuk. They oppose the religious and social injustices in Jerusalem and announce the reality of judgment and distressful collapse. Jeremiah is a complex book, having gone through a major editorial process before reaching its present form in post-exile. He is active as the Babylonians begin to crush the kingdom of Judah, opposing the arrogance of King Jehoiakim, later imprisoned because of his truthful and prophetic voice, only to be summoned from prison by King Zedekiah for secret consultations. He was so disturbing that they wanted to silence him, but could not without his perspective reading of the socio-political and geopolitical realities. Ezekiel was a priestly contemporary who was taken into exile with the first wave of political exiles in 597 BCE. If you've ever tried to read Ezekiel, you'll recognize that he was somewhat eccentric and his visionary language often bizarre. Yet in the crisis, he had a vision of hope and community resurrection. A generation on from from Jeremiah and Ezekiel, in the late 540s BCE, as Babylonian power, like the power of all empires in history, began to fade, an unnamed prophet announced good news of liberation, the second Exodus. Persia was in the ascendancy, and Cyrus, their leader, was a liberator, even described by 2nd Isaiah as a Messiah. There was a slow return to a homeland still in ruins and requiring careful community building dependent on grant aid from the Persians. In this situation, as different visions of community were being put forward, 3rd Isaiah, that's chapters 56 to 66, brings to imagination visions of a peaceful and inclusive community. And social justice is at the heart of 3rd Isaiah's community visions. Joel, Obadiah, Jonah, Haggai, Zechariah all belong to the post-exile period as community building continues and the people struggle to rebuild the temple. Jonah is not a typical prophet. It's really a protest story against a very narrow community exclusiveness. Jonah, and he was probably not a real person, but a character in a powerful protest story, who is a racist with a God who is much too small. Malachi belongs much later, a century later than the post-exile prophets, late 5th century BCE. He reflects themes from Ezra and Nehemiah, 2 leaders in the post-exile Jerusalem, and who did tend to be exclusivists. Malachi, though, advocates integrity in worship and religious practice by encouraging faithful ethical praxis. Well, these are the influential people who shape much of the Hebrew Bible and who created a prophetic stream that flows through and shapes many other books in the Hebrew Bible. And this is especially true, as we'll see a little later, of the book of Deuteronomy. And that's been a kind of short overview introduction. I'm going to stop there. And let's see if there are any questions, and then we'll go into a discussion group with a discussion question. Maybe it was the one some of you were attempting to answer before I finally managed to find my way onto air. Any questions? Okay, well, let's go into.
Sorry, Johnston. Can I just ask? You talked about 1st, 2nd, and then 3rd Isaiah.
Yeah.
Are you meaning that those 3 sections of Isaiah are all written by different people? Or
yeah, I think so.
Over a long period of time.
The book of Isaiah, I think, covers about 200 years.
Oh, right, okay.
And Isaiah 1 to 39 belongs to the beginning of the 8th century, where it's all happening in around Jerusalem. When you come to Isaiah 40 to 55, you're dealing with the Babylonian exile. That's about 200 years later.
Mm-hmm.
And then the 3rd part of Isaiah 56 to 66 seems to be dealing with the period when people have made a return from Babylon. And there is this desperate struggle going on to try and rebuild a community. With tensions that sound familiar, because the rebuilding of the community, there are those who want a very exclusive, pure kind of community. And there are others who are saying, no, hang on, we want a much more inclusive, where everybody's in.
Mm-hmm.
And those tensions run through some of those writings.
So I wonder why they didn't just use their own name, the other 2.
I don't know. I mean, the books we have, we don't have many authors named when you think of it. There are huge. We sometimes, I think, forget that our Hebrew Bible, and not just the Hebrew Bible, Christian Testament as well, there are long processes of we might call today editorial processes going on, and the very creative period where the Hebrew Bible as we now have it was finally shaped was in that period of exile and return from exile. So it's very late. We'll see in a few moments, for example, that Deuteronomy, maybe a classic example, it seems to have gone through about 6 or 7 reprints. And every time you get a reprint and a new edition, you get another bit added. And that's a process which was going on then as well. Anything else? Okay, we go into rooms, Loretto, with the question, which is really, what was the significance of the prophets to the life of ancient Israel, and what significance, if any, do they have for us today?
And that question is on the chat facility, which you'll be able to access once you get into the rooms.
15 minutes. I want to look at Deuteronomy, a prophetic stream, and then we'll look at the role of public theology and what prophets again can say to us about that. Deuteros means second and nomos means law. And Deuteronomy then suggests the second book of the law. Well, if this is the second one, what was the first? What we now have is a book that emerged after a very lengthy editorial process, not completed until the 6th century BCE. We could say that Deuteronomy has gone through various reprints and editions, each edition having new material included. It's more than a book of law. It gives another version of the 10 words of Sinai, and it has all the marks not of a single author, but as Ronald Clements put it, a particular group of writers, preachers and reformers who shared a consistency of purpose that has created a work of coherence, clarity, and intense passion. So Deuteronomy is a book of reflection, ongoing reflection, and reinterpretation by these writers and preachers and reformers, providing a very comprehensive program for community life and practice. Deuteronomy is a way of life in the prophetic tradition. More than that, as Brueggemann has said, the book has given classic articulation to the main themes characteristic of Judaism and of Christianity. In broadest sweep, the book is a formulation of covenant theology, whereby Yahweh and Israel are pledged to exclusive loyalty and fidelity to each other. And at the heart of covenant are the ethics of justice, compassion, mercy, non-violence, and peace. So covenant is essentially a radically alternative vision of economics and a just ordering of society. Deuteronomy has parallels with Hosea and Jeremiah. We might say both prophets were Deuteronomists. Amos was the first of the 8th century prophets, and it may be that the first edition of Deuteronomy came into existence in the 8th century and parallel with Amos. Behind that lies a tradition of Sinai, the 10 words or community constitution of ancient Israel. And this is why the literary construct of the book is built around a series of addresses by Moses. Now, Mosaic authorship is fictive, which does not mean a literary fabrication, but a theological point that's being made, and a serious insistence that what we have in Deuteronomy is in the tradition of Moses. The authors and editors of Deuteronomy are in a Mosaic succession, reinterpreting the tradition for their contemporary today. Well, the first edition seems to belong to the Assyrian period in the 8th century, when covenant was a radical alternative to the political alliance being made with the Assyrians. It was also an alternative to loyalty to those Assyrians. King Ahaz was taking the community in that direction, and the Deuteronomists were saying that loyalty to the empire is abhorrent to the radical loyalty that there is to Yahweh. This is best known as the reform of Josiah, who is said to have discovered a scroll in the temple rubble, and on the basis of a Mosaic document, an early Deuteronomy. And he begins community reform. The second edition of Deuteronomy is produced, therefore, to authorize political resistance to imperial domination. Now, Deuteronomy was reworked again in another critical context, that of the 6th century exile, when the thinkers and opinion makers were deported. Then Deuteronomy is added to, it's reinterpreted for another crisis, now with something to say in the prophetic tradition to what this edition of the book calls the little ones and the next generation. Deuteronomy now has something to say to the children and grandchildren of the Babylonian exiles. And the book was reworked again in the 5th century when exiles returned and were part of the Ezra movement. Ezra gathered the people and read the older materials of Deuteronomy, explaining, interpreting, reinterpreting, and spelling out covenant in a new context for what is meant to be a new form of community. The reuse, according to Brueggemann, by Ezra the scribe, enabled the older material of Deuteronomy to become enormously influential in the shape and cast of Judaism as a people of the Torah. So the prophetic stream flows through Deuteronomy, and it is impossible to say if the primary influence is from Deuteronomy to the 8th and 7th century prophets, or from the prophets to Deuteronomy. But the prophetic movement of prophets like Amos is alive in Deuteronomy, and we can read Deuteronomy in parallel with those prophets. There is, for example, a Deuteronomic style in Jeremiah, and it is claimed that Jeremiah has come down to us in Deuteronomic dress. The prophetic stream goes further. When the Hebrew canon, or accepted list of books, was drawn up, 6 books were described as the former prophets, these being Joshua, Judges, 1st, 2nd Samuel, 1st, 2nd Kings. There is a consensus that these 6 books are referred to as the Deuteronomistic history, because it is believed that they were written from the perspective or the point of view of Deuteronomy. The underlying theology of these 6 books belongs to Deuteronomy. They are then the work of a Deuteronomistic school. So Deuteronomy and the Deuteronomistic history are in the prophetic stream. If you like, the Deuteronomistic writings are alive to the sound of Amos. Or maybe Amos was in tune with the Deuteronomistic school. Well, let's look at public theology today. Deuteronomy is perhaps the most frequently quoted or alluded to book by gospel writers and others in the Christian Testament. It is therefore, it seems, a significant book and has been influential on the early Jesus movement thinking and imagination. Deuteronomy, in its existing text, frequently speaks of today, 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 and yet again, today. The editorial process and the new editions of Deuteronomy are a reminder to later Judaism and Christianity that the work of interpretation is never done, never final, never settled. Not only is there no one fixed interpretation of any scripture, there are varied and diverse interpretations, and more importantly, ever fresh and ever new interpretations. The text has always a surplus of meaning. There is a dynamic openness that never settles, but engages a new crisis, a new context, a new set of circumstances, and interprets yet again and again. That is what Deuteronomy means by today. We are engaged, as the Deuteronomists were, in an endless search for meaning in today's context, not yesterday's, or in lockdown with a fixed, static, timeless meaning. This ongoing interpretative process, a today reading or theology, is the stuff, I suggest, of public theology. Public theology takes the socio-political, economic, and environment seriously. It is engaged with today's world and seeking to apply social ethics to the live issues of public life. In a sense, Deuteronomy is a manual of public theology. Like Amos, Deuteronomy and its historians, the 6 former prophets, are wrestling with ethics in contexts of community disintegration, socioeconomic and political injustices, and environmental destruction. Deuteronomy has been described as declaring a national polity for Israel. The prophetic stream is in a huge struggle to vision an ethical program for public life. There is a struggle with an existential crisis, and some contours of public theology emerge. Nahum Ward-Lev is a contemporary Jewish scholar, and in his very fine book on the liberating path of the prophets, he writes that both Deuteronomy and the prophets are fundamentally disturbed by and seek to remedy the growing gap between the rich and the poor. The prophetic stream again and again draws attention to the widow, the orphan, and the stranger. The prophetic focus is on the especially vulnerable people in society. And the future of any community is connected to the treatment of the poor. Inequality and poverty, social and economic exclusion destroy a society and are to be put right and justice implemented. Deuteronomy is strong on the Sabbath principle, a principle long ignored and avoided by boring Sabbath observance or strict Sabbatarianism. The sabbatical principle is Jubilee, which runs through the Hebrew Bible and the Christian Testament and is the heart of Jesus' manifesto, according to Luke, and is at the core of the Lord's Prayer. It has to do with the cancellation or forgiveness of debt, returning land that has wrongly been taken, letting the land or the earth itself have fallow years or rest from overuse and exploitation, and allowing the poor to have enough to eat and to share in the earth's goods and resources. The prophetic stream and Deuteronomy have a deep suspicion of arrangements of political power. They are suspicious of privilege, of all domination systems, and imperialism. What this usually means is a majority being dominated by an elite, which can be economic domination, political hegemony, or white supremacy. The public theology of the prophetic is suspicious and subversive of all dominating power and privilege. Deuteronomy and the prophets shape a worldview and a social consciousness. The world is viewed through the lens of social justice, compassion, mercy, non-violence, peace. It is a covenantal worldview, a program for action and life together. There is concern for the future, which is why, in Brueggemann's words, the book of Deuteronomy worries about the children. For the future is always the task of the next generation that hopefully has listened long enough and well enough to choose wisely. Okay, back to rooms, and Loretta has 2 more questions for some kind of exploration. What does it mean to be endlessly engaged in the interpretative process? Do we read the Bible as some kind of settled, closed book? And the other question, why is public theology then and now important for the future? how should public theology worry for the children? Okay, we can take 20 minutes, I think, at that.